Okay, hello ladies. Today we're going to talk about forgetting. We're going to look at the forgetting curve and measures of retention. Okay, so there's going to be some important stuff in here that you're going to need to take notes for, so make sure you got pen and paper ready. Alright, first thing, definition of forgetting. It says here, the inability to retrieve previously stored information. As we've said before in class and a few times, it's not that you don't have the information there, it's not necessarily that the information disappears, it's that you cannot find a way to access that information. Okay, and that's what's really important for us to understand. Okay, that the information's somewhere locked away, but we cannot access it. We cannot get it out of our memories. Alright? So, there's some information about forgetting. Hermann Ebbinghaus, a German psychologist, did some study into memory, okay, and after studying memory he realized that there was a pattern and we could measure the rate at which we forget information. Okay, so we are able to measure the amount of information that we retained or remembered, and we can also remember the rate at which we forgot information. Okay, now Ebbinghaus studied himself, and he used nonsense syllables like words like Jax, J-A-X, or I don't know, Izzy, I-Z-Y, or something like that. Words that aren't actual words, but one syllable words that he had to remember. Okay? Basically he would learn a list, then try and remember it, and then learn a new list, let some time elapse and try and remember it, then learn another list, let some more time elapse and try and remember that. Did this quite a few times to be able to find out the rate at which he was able to remember the information. He found this. After 20 minutes, you could recall 58% of the information. After 1 hour, he could only recall 44% of the information. After a day, 34%, and after 1 week, could only recall 21% of the information that he was trying to recall. Then we get a forgetting curve that looks like this. So you can see it there, it shows the pattern of forgetting. You can see that basically we forget information pretty quickly, but then after the decline, it kind of flattens out at about 21% or 20%. Okay, so think about all that information that you learn in class every day that you don't revisit. Okay, you're going to hold on to about 21% of that, and you would have forgotten over 50% of it an hour after you learnt it. Okay, so by recess you've forgotten at least 50% of the stuff you learnt period 1. Okay, that's pretty full on. So some important stuff to remember from Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve is that more than half of all information loss occurs in the first hour, and virtually all of the information that will be lost is lost in the first 9 hours. Alright, some other facts. If learning occurs over a greater period of time, more information is retained, but the rate of forgetting is the same. That sounds like a really difficult sentence to unravel. But what it means is if you learn something over a longer period of time, there is more chance for consolidation, which means you'll still forget quickly, you'll still forget as much as you're going to forget in the first 9 hours, but overall you will remember more. You will retain more information than if you just... Basically it's like quick learning versus slow learning. If you cram for an exam, you might do okay in the exam, but you'll forget it a couple of days later. If you learn something over a period of time, you're more likely to remember it or be able to retrieve it later on. So, also, as we know, the more meaningful and better the encoding, the slower the rate of forgetting. So if you can add more meaning to your elaborative rehearsal, or add more meaning to create a stronger semantic network, then it is going to slow the rate of forgetting. Okay? Remember that initially Ebbinghaus wouldn't have found that out because he wasn't attaching any meaning to his words, he was using nonsense syllables. Alright? That was one of the what's the word I'm looking for? One of the limitations of his study. Interesting fact that if information is well learnt, obviously adding more meaning and better encoding, then regardless of the degree of difficulty of the information or the learning ability that you have, information is retained the same. Okay, so it doesn't matter how difficult it is. Okay, even if it's really hard information or really easy information, if you've learnt it properly, the ability to retain that information is the same. Okay. Also, fast learners and slow learners have the same rate of forgetting. Okay, so how can we measure how well we've retained the information? It's an interesting question. So how can we tell whether something has been forgotten or not? Well, there are 3 ways to do that, and the first one is recall. So recall is, as you would think about it, trying to remember something off the top of your head. Okay? Textbook definition is being asked to reproduce information with the fewest possible cues. Textbook definition is being asked to reproduce information with the fewest possible cues. So if I said, what is your father's name? There are 3 types of recall. There is free recall, asked to remember as much information as possible in no particular order. Okay, so that could be like we did the other day, the list of words. If I just asked you to recall those words without any cues, and I didn't really care about the order, you just had to remember the words, that would be free recall. Serial recall is being able to recall information in the order it was presented. Okay, and cue recall is often giving you a clue to aid in the recall. So, there are 3 types of recall. Okay, you usually get this in the extended response or the short answer part of your exam. So if we were thinking for free recall, you might get an extended response question that asks you something like, explain the Atkinson-Shiffrin model of memory. That's it. Okay? You also, that would be free recall. Okay? You also might say something, might get a question like, please list the 3 levels of memory in the Atkinson-Shiffrin model in order from the longest duration to the shortest duration. And finally, you might get a free recall where, cued recall, where they might say, please explain Craik and Lockhart's theory of working memory. Make sure you use the terms phonological loop and visuospatial sketchpad. Okay, so they've given you cues so you can remember, Craik and Lockhart, I remember their theory because it had those 2 things in it. Okay, hope that makes sense. The next measure of retention is recognition. These are your multiple choice questions. So being able to identify correct information from among alternatives. Okay, you can usually retrieve more information this way than free recall. You might remember this when we do our SACs. You have multiple choice. You feel like the multiple choice questions are easier because the answer is hidden somewhere in there. So your memory is being triggered. Okay, so as it says there, recognition is a more sensitive measure. I'm going to talk about sensitivity in a minute. Alright, but basically multiple choice allows you to use cues to find the information. Okay, also you see this very commonly in lineups, police lineups. That's why they use them for eyewitnesses. If they've got a suspect that they think is perhaps guilty, then you are able to try and pick one of them from a lineup rather than just give your information to a sketch artist. So we did this in class. You can think about, I want you to name Snow White's 7 dwarfs. Go. Pretty tricky, but I think it might be a lot easier if I say now, I want you to remember Snow White's 7 dwarfs. Okay, you'll be looking through these things on your screen saying, oh yeah, I know that one, I know that one. Oh, I'm not sure about that one. Actually, no. That's the one I want, that's the one I don't want. Okay, so you can see the names there. It uses the cues to activate parts of your semantic network so that you can therefore recall the information that you need to recall. Okay, the last one is relearning. Okay, this is learning information again that has already been stored in your long-term memory. This is usually what you do just before a SAC or an exam. Okay, you guys hit up information that you haven't really paid any attention to or done any revision of, so you have to go back, read through the textbook and relearn it. Hopefully we can avoid that for our end-of-year exam. Relearning takes less time than the original time you had to learn it. Okay, and it says there it's the most sensitive measure of retention. Psychologists have figured out ways that you can actually measure how much information you learnt last time around by the way that you, the amount of trials or the amount of time it takes you to relearn information. Looks a bit like this. It's called a savings score. So for example, if it took you a certain amount of times to learn something, let's say how to cook an egg, perhaps, properly, so you would take the number of trials for the original learning, then you would subtract the number of times it took you to relearn it, divide that by the number of trials for original learning, times it by 100. The same is done for time, where we take the amount of time for the original learning, subtract the time for relearning, divide that by the time for original learning to give us, well, times it by 100 over 1 to give us our savings score. Okay, we'll do some more work on this in class, but I think that's pretty straightforward. In the exam, you might get a question that asks you or gives you information like, John took half an hour to learn semantic network theory. Then 6 months later, when he had to relearn it, it only took him 30 minutes. So it would be 60 divided by 30. Sorry, 60 take away 30 divided by 60, which would end up giving us 50%, something like that. Okay? So, that's the savings score. So, the more sensitive the measure, the more likely it is to detect information stored in memory. So, you have your examples there. Recall is the least sensitive. If I ask you who was the President of America before Barack Obama, you might be able to remember that, but you might not. There's no cues there. So if I showed you a photo of 5 people and he was in there, then there's a large chance you'd be able to remember who he was once you saw him. It's more sensitive, which means the photo acts as a larger cue to be able to trigger information that you need, or the retrieval of the information that you need. Relearning is obviously the most sensitive because you are looking straight at the information that you need, and it's most likely that you'll be able to relearn it very quickly. So what you need to remember is that recall is the least sensitive, recognition is more sensitive than recall but less sensitive than relearning, and finally relearning is the most sensitive form measure of retention because we can measure very clearly how much you retained first time around. Okay, that's it for that. And I hope you've taken some notes and there'll be some questions on that in class. See ya. Bye.